Me papa used to say, the desert never forgives, but it always provides, whispers Isabella Herrera as she stands in the shadow of South Mountain, where her father once built an empire that stretched from the borderlands of Nogales to the casino floors of Las Vegas. This isn't another Hollywood fairy tale. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of how Arizona's most feared trafficker became Phoenix's most unlikely pastor. The year was 1995, and Phoenix was a different beast. While the rest of America was worried about the internet and Windows 95, the Sonoran Desert was alive with a different kind of connection. Routes that moved product faster than FedEx and more efficiently than Amazon would ever dream. Carlos El Arquitecto Herrera wasn't just another smuggler. He was the master architect of an operation that turned Arizona's harsh landscape into his personal highway to wealth. Born in Hermosillo, Sonora, Carlos crossed the border at 15 with nothing but calloused hands and dreams bigger than the Superstition Mountains. He started small, moving marijuana through the desert corridors that coyotes had used for generations, learning every wash, every cave, every border patrol checkpoint between Sasabe and Lucaville. But Carlos had vision beyond the small-time operators who thought in pounds while he thought in tons. By the mid-90s, his organization controlled smuggling routes through 3 states. Trucks loaded with furniture crossed at Nogales, hiding compartments filled with cocaine destined for Phoenix's expanding suburbs. Private jets landed at small airstrips in Maricopa County, their cargo manifests listing agricultural equipment while carrying something far more valuable. Even the casinos in Scottsdale unknowingly laundered his money through high-stakes poker games where Carlos's associates would lose millions on purpose. The operation was sophisticated beyond anything law enforcement had seen. Carlos understood that Arizona wasn't just a border state, it was America's gateway to opportunity. While politicians debated immigration policy, he was employing hundreds of people on both sides of the border. Mechanics in Tucson modified vehicles with hidden compartments. Pilots in Flagstaff flew unmarked planes through remote airspace. Even legitimate businessmen in Tempe unknowingly provided services to shell companies that existed only on paper and in Phoenix bank accounts. But success in the trafficking world comes with a target on your back that grows larger with every successful shipment. The DEA's Phoenix Field Division had been tracking Carlos for 3 years, building a case that read like a thriller novel. Operation Desert Storm, not the war, but the federal investigation, involved wiretaps in Spanish and English, surveillance teams that followed him from his Ahwatukee mansion to his children's soccer games in Chandler, and undercover agents who infiltrated his organization by posing as corrupt Border Patrol officers. Carlos lived like a king in a palace built on quicksand. His house in Ahwatukee foothills had views of the entire valley, from Camelback Mountain to the Estrella Mountains, and every sunrise reminded him that he had conquered the desert that had broken so many others. His children attended private schools in Scottsdale, played tennis at the Phoenix Country Club, and spoke perfect English with only the slightest hint of their father's Sonoran accent. The money was intoxicating. Carlos could afford anything: exotic cars parked in his 8-car garage, jewelry for his wife that cost more than most Phoenix homes, vacations to Cabo San Lucas, where they stayed in resorts he partially owned through shell corporations. He had legitimate businesses too, a chain of Mexican restaurants throughout the valley, construction companies that built some of Maricopa County's most expensive developments, and auto dealerships that sold luxury vehicles to Phoenix's elite. But the higher you climb in the desert, the farther you can see the storms coming. Federal agents were closing in, using RICO statutes that could seize everything he had built and send him to federal prison for life. The same desert that had provided his path to wealth was about to become his road to ruin. The night before the federal raids, Carlos stood on his balcony overlooking the Valley of the Sun, watching Phoenix's lights twinkle like stars fallen to earth. He had no idea that tomorrow those lights would look like farewell messages from a life that was about to end forever. The desert winds carried whispers of change, but Carlos was too intoxicated by success to hear them. In 12 hours, everything would change. The man who had built walls of money and power was about to discover that the only walls that matter are the ones that protect your soul. But that revelation was still a lifetime away, a lifetime that would be measured not in years, but in the slow transformation that only comes through complete destruction and divine reconstruction. Arizona's most wanted was about to become God's most willing. But first, he had to lose everything that had made him who he thought he was. The Federal Correctional Institution at Florence sits in the Arizona desert like a concrete mirage, surrounded by the same landscapes where Carlos had once ruled as king. When the prison transport van pulled through the gates on a scorching July morning in 1999, the irony wasn't lost on him. He was back in the desert, but now the desert owned him. Federal prison in Arizona is its own kind of hell. The heat radiates through concrete walls that were built to contain bodies but can't contain the memories that haunt sleepless nights. Carlos's cell in the special housing unit was smaller than his old walk-in closet, with a window that offered a view of nothing but more concrete and endless desert stretching toward mountains that seemed to mock his captivity. The first year was war, against himself, against other inmates who saw his wealth as weakness, and against a system designed to break men who thought they were unbreakable. The Latino inmates respected his reputation, but questioned his loyalty when he refused to join their political games. The white supremacists tested him because they couldn't figure out where a Mexican millionaire fit in their racial hierarchy. Even the guards treated him differently, some with grudging respect, others with the special contempt reserved for criminals who had lived better than they ever would. Solitary confinement became Carlos's second home after a fight in the chow hall over a disrespectful comment about his family. 23 hours a day in a cell, barely large enough for a man to stretch his arms, with 1 hour for exercise in a concrete cage that dog runs look spacious. The silence was deafening. No mariachi music from his favorite Phoenix restaurants, no laughter from his children, no desert wind carrying the scent of creosote and possibility. But sometimes God uses isolation to create intimacy. in that concrete tomb, with nothing but his thoughts and the weight of his choices, Carlos began to confront truths he had spent decades avoiding. The first truth was the hardest. Every dollar he had earned was stained with someone else's pain. Every gram he had smuggled had destroyed families. Every route he had opened had created addicts in Phoenix suburbs and barrios alike. The transformation didn't begin with a dramatic conversion experience. It started with a broken man finding a broken book. Tucked behind the toilet in his solitary cell, wrapped in plastic like contraband, was a Spanish Bible so worn. While Carlos was finding salvation behind federal walls, his family was discovering what survival looked like in Phoenix without their protector and provider. Maria Herrera had married a king, but now she was raising 3 children alone in a city that had suddenly turned its back on the family name. The mansion in Ahwatukee foothills, once a symbol of success, with its infinity pool overlooking the valley and 8-car garage filled with luxury vehicles, became a monument to loss. Federal asset forfeiture had seized their bank accounts, frozen their investments, and left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and mortgage payments they couldn't make. Maria, who had never worked outside managing their household staff, suddenly found herself filling out applications at Target, Walmart, and every restaurant along Ray Road. The stigma followed them everywhere in Phoenix's tight-knit Latino community. When your husband's face is on Univision and Telemundo being led away in federal custody, you don't just lose your family, you lose your place in the community that had once celebrated your success. Church friends at their parish in Tempe stopped calling. School parents at their children's private academy in Scottsdale avoided her during pickup. Even their longtime housekeeper, Esperanza, who had been like family, couldn't risk being associated with them anymore. Isabella, the eldest at 16, felt the weight of becoming the family translator and negotiator before she was ready. At Xavier College Preparatory, whispers followed her down hallways lined with college banners and dreams that suddenly seemed impossible. Esa es la hija del narco, classmates would say in Spanish, as if her father's choices had erased her own potential. The young woman who had grown up expecting to attend ASU or University of Arizona instead inherited shame and responsibility that aged her beyond her years. Her younger brother, Diego, dealt with the crisis differently. At 14, he was old enough to understand that their world had collapsed, but young enough to believe it might be rebuilt. He kept his father's pictures on his bedroom wall in their new apartment, a cramped 3-bedroom in South Phoenix, where the air conditioning fought losing battles against desert heat, and the walls were thin enough to hear their neighbors' struggles and dreams. The youngest, 10-year-old Sofia, asked questions that shattered her mother's heart. «Cuando regresa papá? ¿Por qué no podemos ir a Disneyland otra vez? ¿Somos pobres ahora?» How do you explain federal conspiracy charges to a child who still believes in fairy tales and happy endings, especially when you're struggling to believe in them yourself? Maria took jobs that paid cash under the table, cleaning houses in Paradise Valley for families who had more in their wine cellars than she now had in her checking account. Working catering events at the Phoenix Convention Center, where she served appetizers to people who lived in her old neighborhood. The irony was sharp as broken glass. She was now serving the very class of people she had once belonged to. The apartment in South Phoenix was a cultural shock.
After years in Awatuki's manicured suburbs, they were back in the barrio, not the romanticized version from movies, but the real one, where quinceañeras and gang funerals happened on the same street corner. The sounds were different. Police helicopters instead of golf course sprinklers. Banda music from neighbors instead of classical from their old sound system. Conversations in rapid Spanish instead of the careful English they had practiced in affluent circles. But something began to change around year 3 of Carlos's incarceration. The letters started arriving, not the angry, self-pitying rants Maria had expected, but something entirely different. Pages filled with apologies so specific they could only come from genuine remorse. Bible verses that spoke directly to their pain, written in Carlos's handwriting, but expressing thoughts that seemed to come from someone else entirely. The first letter that made Maria cry came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered to their apartment mailbox like any other piece of correspondence. But the words inside were anything but ordinary. Mi querida Maria, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway, not because I deserve it, but because you and our children deserve better than carrying the poison of my choices in your hearts. I destroyed the foundation of our family, but I believe God can help us build something stronger from the pieces. Week after week, the letters continued. Carlos wrote to Isabella about strength, explaining that real power comes from character, not from money or reputation. He encouraged her academic achievements, somehow researching scholarship opportunities from his prison library and connecting her with mentors through the chaplain's network. When she was accepted to Arizona State University on a partial scholarship, his letter of congratulations from federal prison meant more than any gift had ever meant. To Diego, he wrote about manhood and integrity, sharing lessons he wished he had learned before destroying their family's future. He encouraged his son's interest in engineering, sending articles he had clipped from magazines about Latino professionals who were building bridges instead of trafficking routes. Diego began to see his father's imprisonment not as shame, but as the price of authentic transformation. Little Sophia received letters filled with drawings and stories, maintaining a connection across concrete walls and steel bars. Carlos drew pictures of desert flowers and mountain sunsets, reminding his daughter that beauty could emerge from the harshest conditions. He wrote about God's love in terms a child could understand, comparing it to the way a desert spring provides water for all who are thirsty. But it was the letter addressed to the entire family, arriving during their 4th Christmas without him, that began to heal what seemed irreparably broken. My beloved family, I used to think providing for you meant giving you things, houses, cars, private schools, vacations to places where we could pretend we belonged. But I confused wealth with worth, possessions with provision. In this place, stripped of everything I thought made me a man, I've learned that the greatest gift a father can give his children isn't money or security, it's integrity. I failed at that, but by God's grace, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it right. The letters weren't just words on paper, they were blueprints for rebuilding. Maria began attending Spanish-language services at Iglesia Bautista Emanuel in South Phoenix, not because she was suddenly religious, but because she needed community and hope. The pastor's wife, Hermana Lopez, became a surrogate mother, helping with bills and childcare, asking nothing in return but Maria's presence at Wednesday night prayer meetings. The transformation in Carlos's letters reflected a transformation in his heart, but it also demanded transformation from them. Isabella channeled her anger into academics and community service, volunteering at immigrant resource centers and translating for families navigating the same system that had destroyed hers. Her pain became purpose. Her family's tragedy became fuel for helping others. Diego joined the church youth group, finding positive male role models in men who had overcome their own struggles with addiction and crime. When he won a state science fair with a project about solar energy in the desert, the letter of congratulations from his father in federal prison meant more than any trophy. Little Sophia began to understand that her father's absence was teaching lessons about presence. She learned to treasure phone calls that lasted exactly 15 minutes, the maximum allowed, and to find God's love in her mother's sacrifice, her siblings' protection, and her community's support. The family that had been shattered by federal prosecutors was slowly being rebuilt by grace, one letter at a time. In the desert, where survival requires deep roots and patient growth, the Herrera family was learning that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom only after the harshest storms. Phoenix's unforgiving sun was teaching them the same lesson it had taught generations of desert dwellers. What doesn't kill you can make you stronger, but only if you're willing to change, adapt, and find water in unexpected places. March 15, 2024, after 25 years in federal prison, Carlos Herrera walked out of FCI Florence into an Arizona morning that felt like stepping into another planet. The Phoenix skyline had doubled in size, filled with glass towers and tech companies that had transformed the valley into Silicon Desert. At 58, Carlos was starting over with nothing but a federal ID, $200 in gate money, and a faith that had been forged in concrete and tested by time. The Uber ride from Florence to South Phoenix gave him